A cold autumn wind swept across the rolling hills of medieval England. Dark clouds drifted slowly overhead as the banners of Ravenstone Castle fluttered above its towering stone walls. Surrounded by dense forests and deep moats, the ancient fortress had stood for centuries, guarding the northern frontier of the kingdom. Within its walls lived Edward Ashcroft, an 18-year-old nobleman. Though born into a respected family, he was no prince. His father, Sir Richard Ashcroft, had been a loyal knight who gave his life defending England's northern border from invading forces. Since his father's death, Edward had been raised by his widowed mother, Lady Eleanor. Before the first light of dawn touched the castle towers, Edward was already training. He practiced swordsmanship until his arms ached, fired arrows at distant targets, rode his horse across the castle grounds, and learned the discipline, honor, and responsibility expected of every knight. His mentor, the aging knight Sir William, watched him closely. One morning, after another long training session, Sir William rested his hand on Edward's shoulder and said, "Any man can carry a sword, Edward, but only a true knight knows when it should remain in its scabbard." Edward lowered his practice sword and replied firmly, "I swear that I will never draw my blade in the service of injustice." Sir William smiled quietly. "Your father once made that very same promise." Later that afternoon, the peaceful silence of Ravenstone Castle was shattered by the blast of war horns. A guard shouted from the gate, "A royal messenger has arrived." The nobles and knights gathered inside the great hall as a messenger bearing the king's seal stepped forward and unrolled a parchment. The letter declared that rebellion had erupted along England's northern frontier. By royal command, every loyal knight and nobleman capable of bearing arms was ordered to report immediately to the capital. As the hall fell silent, Lady Eleanor looked into her son's eyes. "War creates heroes," she said softly. "But it also leaves mothers waiting, and sons never returning." Edward met her gaze without hesitation. "If I do not answer the king's call, who will honor father's sacrifice?" That night, unable to sleep, Edward climbed to the highest tower of Ravenstone Castle. The cold wind howled across the battlements as he looked over the endless forest, stretching into the darkness. Far away, a single fire burned among the trees. As he watched, an elderly monk quietly approached him. The old man asked, "Do you know what that fire means?" Edward shook his head. "No." The monk stared toward the distant flames. "It means someone is searching for an ancient secret." Edward frowned. "What secret?" The old monk lowered his voice. "The lost crown of England." Edward's heart skipped a beat. The monk continued, "Many years ago, the true royal crown disappeared. The crown worn by the king today is only a ceremonial copy. Legend says that whoever discovers the real crown is destined to unite England under its rightful ruler." From beneath his worn cloak, the monk carefully removed an old leather map, its edges faded with age. He placed it into Edward's hands. "This belonged to your father. Before he died, he asked me to give it to you only after you had proven yourself worthy." Edward stared at the mysterious map, his hands trembling. Suddenly, the thunder of galloping horses echoed beyond the castle walls. Moments later, a wounded soldier crashed through the main gate and collapsed onto the stone courtyard. Covered in blood, he struggled to speak. "They're coming, the soldiers of the Black Banner." Before anyone could ask another question, he lost consciousness. The castle gates slammed shut. Across the distant hills, hundreds of torches burst into life, illuminating the darkness. An enormous army was marching toward Ravenstone Castle. Their banners were black. Their commander remained unknown. Edward tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword. He had no idea that this night would mark the beginning of the greatest adventure of his life. The alarm bells echoed across Ravenstone Castle. Every soldier rushed to the walls while blacksmiths hurried to sharpen swords and repair damaged armor. Servants carried buckets of water, stacked arrows beside the battlements, and reinforced the heavy wooden gates with thick oak beams. Edward climbed the western wall beside Sir William. Beyond the valley, Hundreds of black banners moved like a dark tide across the hills. Thousands of soldiers marched in perfect formation, their armor reflecting the light of countless torches. Sir William narrowed his eyes. "This is no ordinary army," Edward asked quietly. "Who are they?" The old knight answered, "Mercenaries. Trained killers. Someone wealthy has hired them." A cold silence settled between them. Inside the great hall, Lord Robert, commander of Ravenstone Castle, gathered every night around a large wooden map. "Our scouts report nearly 3,000 enemy soldiers." The room erupted with concern. "We have barely 600 defenders." "Another night," muttered. "We cannot survive a siege." Lord Robert remained calm. "We are not here to survive." He looked at every man in the room. "We are here to buy England time." Edward felt his heart pound. This was no training exercise. This was real war. As darkness covered the countryside, the enemy army stopped outside the castle. Then something unexpected happened. One lone rider emerged from the enemy ranks carrying a white flag. The castle gate opened only slightly. The mysterious rider removed his helmet. His face was hidden beneath a black hood. He spoke in a calm voice. "Open your gates, and no innocent blood will be spilled." Lord Robert answered from the walls. "State your name." The stranger smiled. "Names are meaningless." He slowly raised a silver medallion engraved with a black raven. Sir William suddenly became pale. Edward noticed immediately. "You know that symbol?" The old knight whispered. "I hoped I would never see it again." Edward stared at him. "What is it?" Sir William answered. "The Order of the Black Raven." Edward had never heard those words before. Sir William continued. "They disappeared nearly 30 years ago. They served no king. They served only power." The messenger looked toward the castle walls. "Our master seeks only one thing." Lord Robert shouted. "What does he want?" The stranger replied. "The map." Edward froze. The old leather map inside his cloak suddenly felt heavier than iron. The enemy already knew. Someone had betrayed them. Without another word, the messenger turned his horse and rode back into the darkness. A few moments later, a massive war horn echoed across the valley. The earth itself seemed to tremble. Thousands of enemy soldiers raised their shields together. Archers stepped forward. Siege towers rolled slowly toward the castle. Huge wooden catapults were dragged into position. Sir William drew his sword. "It begins." Suddenly, the night sky exploded. Hundreds of flaming arrows flew through the darkness like falling stars. "Archers!" Edward shouted. The castle walls erupted into chaos. Men raised their shields. Arrows struck stone. Others found flesh. A young guard beside Edward cried out before collapsing from an arrow through his shoulder. Edward had never seen death so close. His hands trembled. Sir William placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Fear is natural. Do not let it command you." Edward nodded. He drew his father's sword for the first time. The steel reflected the fire burning across the battlefield. Below them, enormous battering rams rolled toward the castle gate. The first great battle of Ravenstone Castle had begun. Far beyond the battlefield, hidden deep within the ancient forest, a cloaked figure watched the flames from the top of a rocky hill. He whispered to himself, "The boy has the map." He smiled beneath his hood. "Soon, he will lead us to the lost crown." The wind carried his laughter into the darkness, and for the first time, Edward Ashcroft realized that this war was never truly about the castle. It was about a secret buried for generations, a secret powerful enough to decide the future of England itself. The sky above Ravenstone Castle glowed red, with fire and smoke. Flaming arrows rained down relentlessly, crashing into rooftops, towers, and wooden buildings inside the fortress. A grain store burst into flames, while the cries of wounded soldiers echoed through the castle courtyard. Edward stood upon the battlements, staring at the battlefield below. His heart pounded violently. This was his first real battle. Sir William stepped beside him and said, "From this moment, you are no longer just a young man, Edward. Tonight, you must fight as a true knight." Edward nodded with determination. Suddenly, boom! A massive stone launched from an enemy catapult slammed into the northern wall. The entire fortress shook. Dust and broken stones filled the air. A castle guard shouted, Catapults! They're trying to breach the walls! Moments later, another enormous boulder crashed into the same section of the wall. Cracks spread across the ancient stone like lightning. Below, the soldiers beneath the black banner roared together with terrifying battle cries. Their voices echoed across the valley. Lord Robert raised his sword high. "Archers, loose your flaming arrows." Hundreds of English longbowmen pulled back their bowstrings. A storm of arrows filled the night sky. Many enemy soldiers fell to the ground. But for every man who fell, two more stepped forward. The enemy army seemed endless. Then the enormous battering ram rolled toward the castle gate. Nearly 50 armored soldiers pushed the giant wooden weapon. Their heavy shields protected them from the rain of arrows. The first strike landed. Crash! The great oak gate trembled. A second strike followed. Crash! The iron hinges groaned under the impact. With the third blow, the entire castle seemed to shake. Sir William looked toward the gate. It won't hold much longer. Edward hurried down from the walls. Large iron cauldrons filled with boiling oil had been prepared above the gateway. Lord Robert gave the order. Wait until they're directly beneath the gate. The enemy struck again. At that exact moment, the defenders poured boiling oil onto the attackers below. Terrible screams filled the battlefield. Dozens of enemy soldiers collapsed in agony. Yet the survivors refused to retreat. They simply continued their assault. Then, a gigantic warrior riding a black warhorse slowly emerged from the enemy ranks. Every piece of his armor was black. His face remained hidden behind a dark steel helmet. In his hands rested an enormous two-handed sword unlike anything Edward had ever seen. Without speaking a single word, the warrior slowly raised his sword toward the sky. Instantly, thousands of Black Banner soldiers charged forward once again. Sir William's face turned pale. He whispered, "Impossible." Edward looked at him. "Do you know him?" The old knight remained silent for a long moment before answering. "If I am not mistaken, that is the commander of the Order of the Black Raven, Lord Malric." The surrounding knights stared in disbelief. One of them whispered, "But he died years ago." Sir William replied quietly, "So we all believed." Without warning, Lord Malric spurred his horse forward. He rode straight toward the castle gate. With a single swing of his enormous sword, he struck down an English soldier who stood in his path. His strength was beyond human. Wherever he rode, men stepped aside in fear. Edward realized immediately, this was no ordinary warrior. At that very moment, the old leather map hidden beneath Edward's cloak suddenly grew warm. Startled, he pulled it from inside his tunic. The strange red symbol drawn at its center began to glow faintly. It was as though the map had awakened. The old monk's words echoed in Edward's mind. "When the time comes, the map itself will show you the way." Edward stared at the glowing parchment in astonishment. Then, a desperate scream echoed from inside the castle. "Traitor! The enemy has breached the castle from within." Edward and Sir William looked at one another. The same question filled both of their minds. Who was the traitor inside Ravenstone Castle? And was that traitor about to hand over the secret of the lost crown of England? The cry of "traitor" echoed through every corridor of Ravenstone Castle. Panic spread instantly. Soldiers abandoned their positions on the walls and rushed toward the inner courtyard. Torches flickered wildly as confusion swept through the fortress. Edward gripped his sword tightly. "Sir William, if the enemy is already inside the castle, then the gates are no longer our greatest danger." Sir William nodded grimly. "No, now the danger is behind us." Without another word, they raced toward the great hall. Inside the castle, chaos had erupted. Several guards lay dead in pools of blood. One wounded soldier struggled to breathe. Edward knelt beside him. "Who did this?" The guard coughed violently. "One of our own." His eyes slowly closed. He was gone. Edward rose to his feet, anger burning inside him. Someone inside Ravenstone had betrayed them. Suddenly, a loud explosion shook the castle. Boom! One of the underground storage doors burst open. A dozen soldiers dressed in black armor rushed into the courtyard. They had entered through an ancient tunnel hidden beneath the castle. The traitor had opened it from the inside. The defenders were caught completely by surprise. Steel clashed against steel. The courtyard became another battlefield. Edward drew his father's sword. For the first time, he charged into battle. An enemy soldier lunged toward him with a spear. Edward stepped aside at the last second. With one swift strike, the spear split in two. The attacker fell to the ground. Before Edward could recover, another soldier swung an axe toward his head. Sir William intercepted the blow with his shield. "Stay focused." Edward nodded. Together, they fought back. Back. Every lesson Sir William had taught him suddenly became real. This was no longer training. Every mistake meant death. Across the courtyard, Lord Robert continued commanding the defense. "Protect the Great Hall. No one reaches the map." Edward froze. The map. The enemy wasn't attacking the castle. They were hunting him. Edward nodded. Together, they fought back. Back. Every lesson Sir William had taught him suddenly became real. This was no longer training. Every mistake meant death. Across the courtyard, Lord Robert continued commanding the defense. "Protect the Great Hall. No one reaches the map." Edward froze. The map. The enemy wasn't attacking the castle. They were hunting him. At that moment, the mysterious leather map beneath Edward's cloak began glowing once again. This time, the red symbol shone brighter than ever before. Then something unbelievable happened. Faint lines slowly appeared across the ancient parchment. They had not been there before. A hidden route, an ancient path, leading deep into the forests north of Ravenstone. Edward whispered, "It's changing." Sir William stared at the map in disbelief. The legend was true. Before either of them could speak again, a deep voice echoed across the courtyard. "Bring me the boy." Lord Malric had entered the castle. His black armor was stained with blood. He walked calmly through the battlefield as terrified soldiers stepped aside. No one dared challenge him. His enormous sword rested upon his shoulder. His dark helmet hid every trace of his face. He stopped only a few yards from Edward. For several silent seconds, neither man moved. Then Lord Malric spoke. His voice was cold and calm. "Edward Ashcroft." Edward tightened his grip on his sword. "You know my name." Malric nodded. "I knew your father." Edward's eyes widened. "You're lying." The Black Knight gave a quiet laugh. "Your father died protecting the map. Just as you will." Without warning, Lord Malric attacked. His massive sword crashed against Edward's blade with overwhelming force. Edward was thrown backward across the stone courtyard. Pain shot through his arms. He could barely hold his sword. Malric advanced slowly. Each step echoed like thunder. "You fight well. But you are not your father." Edward struggled to stand. Blood trickled from his forehead. His hands trembled. For the first time, he truly feared death. Then, a horn sounded from beyond the eastern forest. Everyone stopped. Even Lord Malric turned toward the distant hills. From the darkness, hundreds of riders carrying blue banners emerged beneath the moonlight. Reinforcements had arrived. The battle for Ravenstone Castle was far from over. But Edward realized something even more dangerous. Lord Malric already knew far too much about his father, and about the mysterious map. The sound of a war horn echoed from the eastern forest, and for a brief moment, the entire battlefield fell silent. Under the pale moonlight, hundreds of horsemen carrying blue banners thundered toward Ravenstone Castle. The pounding of their horses' hooves shook the ground beneath them. A soldier standing on the castle wall shouted with joy, "Reinforcements! The king's army has arrived." Hope returned to the defenders of Ravenstone Castle, but Lord Malric showed no sign of fear. He calmly watched the approaching cavalry before speaking in a cold voice. "They have arrived just in time, yet far too late."
Edward slowly rose to his feet. Blood ran down his forehead, and his arms trembled with exhaustion. Yet, the fear in his eyes had been replaced by determination. He pointed his sword toward Malric. "I won't let you leave this castle alive." Malric smiled faintly. Anger does not make a warrior stronger. It makes him weaker. Without another word, he charged. Their swords collided with a deafening clash. Once, twice, again, and again. Sparks burst into the air with every strike. Edward fought with everything he had, but he quickly realized he was no match for Malric's overwhelming strength and experience. Suddenly, Sir William stepped between them. "Edward, fall back." Malric stopped for a moment and looked directly at the old knight. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Malric broke the silence. "It has been many years, William." Sir William tightened his grip on his sword. "I believed you died long ago." Malric's voice remained calm. "I am far more difficult to kill than you remember." Everyone in the courtyard stared in confusion. Edward looked at Sir William. "You know him?" The old knight sighed heavily. "Many years ago, we fought side by side." Edward could hardly believe what he had heard. "What?" Sir William lowered his head. "Yes, I was once a member of the Order of the Black Raven." Silence swept across the battlefield. Malric laughed. "At last, you have spoken the truth," Sir William replied firmly. "When I discovered that the Order had abandoned honor and began slaughtering innocent people in pursuit of power, I walked away." Malric's eyes burned with anger. "And today, you will finally pay for that betrayal." Without warning, Malric attacked. His enormous sword crashed against Sir William's blade. The two veteran warriors fought with incredible speed. Steel rang through the courtyard as sparks flew into the night. Their movements were so fast that most soldiers could barely follow them. Edward realized this was more than a battle. It was the final chapter of a rivalry that had begun decades ago. Taking advantage of the distraction, Lord Robert hurried toward Edward. He spoke in a low, urgent voice. "Listen carefully. You must leave the castle immediately." Edward looked at him in disbelief. "But the battle." Lord Robert gripped his shoulder firmly. "Even if Ravenstone falls, England can still survive. But if that map falls into the enemy's hands, the entire kingdom will be doomed." He placed a small leather pouch into Edward's hand. Inside was a golden ring engraved with the symbol of a lion. "This belonged to your father. When you reach the capital, the king himself will recognize this seal." Suddenly, a tremendous crash shook the fortress. The northern wall collapsed in a cloud of dust and stone. Enemy soldiers poured through the breach, shouting victory cries. The castle's final line of defense had fallen. Sir William continued fighting Malric with everything he had. Between powerful blows, he shouted, "Edward, run! Take the map and escape!" Edward hesitated for only a moment. He looked around one last time. The burning castle, the wounded soldiers, the smoke-filled sky, and Sir William, risking his life to protect him. His eyes filled with tears, but he knew his duty. His mission was no longer to fight. It was to protect the map. Following the glowing path that had appeared on the ancient parchment, Edward turned and sprinted toward the hidden tunnel beneath Ravenstone Castle. Behind him, Sir William's voice echoed through the flames. "Stay alive, Edward, because only you can change the future of England." Edward disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel. He had no idea that an even greater secret awaited him on the other side. The hidden tunnel beneath Ravenstone Castle was cold, damp, and silent. Edward ran as fast as he could, the echo of his footsteps bouncing off the ancient stone walls. Behind him, the sounds of battle grew fainter with every step, but Sir William's final words still echoed in his mind. "Stay alive, Edward. Only you can change the future of England." He tightened his grip on the leather map. The strange red symbol upon it continued to glow, lighting his path through the darkness. After what felt like nearly an hour, Edward finally reached the end of the tunnel. A heavy stone door stood before him. With all his strength, he pushed it open. Fresh night air rushed into his lungs. He had emerged deep inside the ancient Blackwood forest, miles away from Ravenstone Castle. Behind him, the castle was still burning. Columns of black smoke rose into the night sky. Edward silently whispered, "Please, let Sir William still be alive." But there was no time to mourn. The mission had only just begun. As dawn slowly broke over the forest, Edward followed the glowing path marked on the map. The deeper he traveled, the stranger the forest became. Towering oak trees blocked out the sunlight. Thick mist drifted between the trunks. Not a single bird sang. The silence felt unnatural. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind him. Edward instantly drew his sword. "Who's there?" No answer came, only silence. Then, another sound. Closer this time, a shadow darted between the trees. Edward carefully stepped forward. Out from the mist emerged a young woman wearing a dark green cloak. She carried a longbow across her back and a hunting knife at her belt. Her sharp blue eyes never left Edward. "You're far from the King's Road," she said calmly. Edward kept his sword raised. "Who are you?" She smiled slightly. "My name is Lady Isabella of Ashbourne, and I've been waiting for you." Edward frowned. "Waiting for me?" She nodded. "The old monk sent word before the castle was attacked." Edward's heart skipped a beat. "You know the monk?" "I've known him all my life." She looked at the glowing map in Edward's hands. "So, you really have it." Edward instinctively hid the map beneath his cloak. "How do I know I can trust you?" Lady Isabella answered without hesitation. "You don't. Trust has to be earned." Before Edward could reply, an arrow suddenly flew out of the trees. Whoosh! It narrowly missed Edward's head. "Down!" Isabella shouted. More arrows followed. Black Banner soldiers burst from the forest. They had tracked Edward all the way to Blackwood. "There he is. Take the map." Edward and Isabella ran behind a fallen oak tree. Arrows struck the bark all around them. Isabella quickly drew her bow. Without wasting a single arrow, she released one shot. An enemy soldier fell instantly. A second arrow. Another soldier collapsed. Edward stared in amazement. "You're an incredible archer," she answered, while drawing another arrow. "Compliments can wait. Fight." The battle inside the forest had begun. Edward charged forward with his sword. One enemy swung an axe. Edward blocked it. Another attacked from behind. Isabella's arrow struck him before he reached Edward. Together, they fought like they had known each other for years. After several minutes of fierce fighting, the surviving Black Banner soldiers retreated into the forest. Silence returned once more. Edward lowered his sword, breathing heavily. "Thank you." Isabella smiled. "Save your thanks." She looked toward the mountains rising in the distance. This was only the first group. Edward followed her gaze. Snow-covered peaks stretched across the horizon. Isabella pointed toward them. "Beyond those mountains lies Greyhaven Abbey." Edward asked, "What's there?" She answered quietly, "The man who knows the true secret of the lost crown." Edward looked down at the glowing map once more. Its red symbol had changed again. Now it pointed directly toward the mountains, far away, hidden among the trees. A pair of dark eyes watched them leave. The mysterious figure whispered, "Let them continue. They'll lead us exactly where we need to go." Without realizing it, Edward was no longer running from the enemy. He was unknowingly leading them toward England's greatest secret. The first rays of dawn broke over the snow-covered mountains as Edward and Lady Isabella left the Blackwood forest behind. A cold wind swept across the narrow mountain trail, carrying with it an eerie silence. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Suddenly, Isabella stopped. She knelt beside the rocky path and examined the ground. Edward frowned. "What is it?" She pointed towards several fresh horseshoe prints pressed into the mud. "We're not alone." Edward looked around cautiously, but saw nothing except towering cliffs and drifting mist. "Summoning has been following us." Several hours later, they reached an ancient stone bridge spanning a roaring mountain river. Time had nearly destroyed it. Its wooden planks creaked beneath every step. Beyond the bridge stood the only road leading to Greyhaven Abbey. Isabella took a deep breath. "Once we cross this bridge, there's no turning back." Edward nodded and stepped forward. Suddenly, a loud voice echoed from the cliffs above. "Do not take another step." Edward looked up. Nearly 20 black banner soldiers stood on the rocks with their bows aimed directly at them. At their front stood a mysterious commander, wearing a dark, iron mask. He slowly raised his hand. "Hand over the map, and you may live." Edward tightened his grip on his father's sword. "Never." Commander lowered his hand. Instantly, a volley of arrows filled the sky. "Run!" Isabella shouted. The two sprinted across the bridge as arrows struck the wooden planks around them. Then, one arrow sliced through a supporting rope. Crack! The bridge lurched violently. Another arrow followed. The ancient ropes snapped. The bridge began collapsing into the raging river below. Edward grabbed Isabella's hand. Together, they leaped towards solid ground. Behind them, the bridge crashed into the river and disappeared beneath the rushing water. The pursuing soldiers could go no farther. Breathing heavily, Isabella looked back. That was far too close. Edward nodded silently. Then he noticed something unusual. The leather map beneath his cloak had begun glowing once again. This time, golden words slowly appeared across the ancient parchment. "Only the heir of the bloodline may open the gate." Edward stared in confusion. "What does that mean?" Isabella answered quietly. "Perhaps your family is connected to the lost crown in ways even you don't understand." By late afternoon, they finally reached the summit. Hidden among the mist stood the ancient Greyhaven Abbey. Its towering stone walls were covered in moss. Broken statues lined the entrance. The great wooden doors had not been opened for decades, or so it seemed. Without warning, the massive doors slowly opened by themselves. An elderly monk dressed in white robes stepped outside. His long silver beard swayed gently in the mountain wind. He looked directly at Edward and smiled. "Welcome, Edward Ashcroft." Edward froze. "You know my name?" The old monk nodded. "I know far more than your name." He stepped closer. "I was the man who held you in my arms on the day you were born." Edward's heart raced. The old monk took a deep breath before speaking again. "Sir Richard Ashcroft." He paused. "The man you have always believed to be your father." Edward's hands began to tremble. The monk finished the sentence. "Was not your true father." The leather map nearly slipped from Edward's hands. His voice shook. "Then, who am I?" The old monk looked toward the mountains beyond the abbey. His expression grew solemn. "The answer has been hidden alongside the lost crown of England for nearly 200 years. Far above them, thunder rolled across the darkening sky." Edward realized that everything he had believed about his life was about to change forever. The ancient halls of Greyhaven Abbey were silent. Only the sound of the wind echoed through the broken stone corridors as Edward and Lady Isabella followed the old monk into a hidden chamber beneath the abbey. In the center of the room stood a massive round table carved from black stone. Upon it rested a faded tapestry embroidered with the royal crest of England. The old monk gently placed his hand upon it. For more than 200 years, this secret has been guarded by the Brotherhood of Greyhaven. Edward stepped closer. "Tell me the truth. Who am I?" The old monk looked directly into Edward's eyes. After a long silence, he spoke. "You are not Edward Ashcroft by birth." Edward's heart nearly stopped. The monk continued. "Your real name is Edward Pendrake. You are the last living descendant of King Edmund II, the final king who wore the true crown of England." Edward stared in disbelief. "That's impossible." The monk slowly shook his head. "When the Black Raven betrayed the crown many years ago, the royal family was hunted down. To save the last surviving child, Sir Richard Ashcroft sacrificed everything. He raised you as his own son and hid your true identity from the world." Tears filled Edward's eyes. Everything he believed about his life had been a lie. Yet, it had been a lie told to protect him. The old monk walked toward an ancient wall, covered with strange symbols. He removed a silver key hanging from his neck. With a loud rumble, a secret passage slowly opened. A cold breeze flowed out from the darkness. The monk whispered, "Beyond this passage lies the Hall of Kings. The lost crown has rested there for nearly 2 centuries." Suddenly, the silence was shattered. Boom! The great doors of the abbey exploded inward. Stone fragments flew across the hall. Black banner soldiers stormed inside. Behind them walked Lord Malric. His black armor was scratched from countless battles, yet his eyes burned with the same cold determination. He smiled. "Thank you for leading me here." Edward drew his sword. "This ends today." Malric laughed. "No, today it truly begins." The old monk quickly turned toward Edward. He pressed the glowing leather map into Edward's hands. "Go. The crown must never fall into his hands." Lady Isabella nocked an arrow. "I'll hold them off." Without another word, Edward ran into the hidden passage. Behind him, the sounds of battle echoed through the abbey. Steel clashed, arrows flew, voices cried out in the darkness. Edward followed the glowing map deep beneath the mountain. After several minutes, he reached an enormous underground chamber. In its center stood a magnificent stone pedestal. Resting upon it was a golden crown. It shimmered in the faint light of ancient torches. Rubies, emeralds, and sapphires sparkled across its surface. It was the lost crown of England. As Edward slowly reached toward it, a familiar voice echoed behind him. "Don't touch it." Edward turned. Lord Malric stood at the entrance of the chamber. His sword was already drawn. He had followed Edward through the secret passage. Malric smiled beneath his black helmet. "Only one of us will leave this chamber alive." Edward tightened his grip on his father's sword. He knew there was no escape. The final battle had begun. The underground chamber fell silent. Only the flickering flames of ancient torches illuminated the lost crown of England, resting upon its stone pedestal. Edward stood with his father's sword in hand. Across from him, Lord Malric slowly removed his black helmet. For the first time, Edward saw the face of the man who had haunted him since the fall of Ravenstone Castle. A long scar ran across Malric's face, and his cold gray eyes showed neither mercy nor fear. He smiled. "So, this is where our journey ends." Edward raised his sword. "No, this is where England begins again." Without another word, Malric attacked. His enormous sword crashed against Edward's blade. The force threw Edward backward. Stone shattered beneath their feet. Again and again, their swords clashed through the ancient chamber. Malric was stronger, more experienced. Every strike pushed Edward closer to defeat. Blood dripped from Edward's arm. His breathing grew heavy. Malric laughed. "You carry the blood of kings, but not the strength to rule." Edward remembered Sir William's words. "A true knight fights, not with anger, but with honor." He closed his eyes for a single moment. Then, his fear disappeared. When Malric attacked again, Edward stepped aside, instead of meeting the blow head-on. Using Malric's own momentum against him, Edward struck the Black Knight's exposed side. The sword pierced his armor. Malric staggered backward. For the first time, he was wounded. His smile vanished. With a furious roar, he launched one final attack. The two swords collided with incredible force. Crack! Malric's sword snapped in half. Edward's blade stopped at his enemy's throat. The chamber became silent. Malric looked into Edward's eyes. Slowly, he dropped to his knees. Finish it. Edward stared at him. After a long silence, he lowered his sword. No, justice is not revenge. England needs peace, not another execution. For the first time in many years, Lord Malric bowed his head. Edward slowly walked toward the stone pedestal. He placed both hands upon the ancient crown. As he lifted it, golden light filled the chamber. The walls trembled. Ancient bells hidden deep beneath the mountain began to ring. The old monk, Lady Isabella, and the surviving defenders entered the chamber. The old monk smiled. He knelt before Edward. Long live the rightful King of England. One by one, everyone present knelt. Even Lord Malric lowered his head. Edward looked at the ancient crown in his hands. He did not place it upon his head immediately. Instead, he said, "A crown is not a prize. It is a promise to protect every man, woman, and child of England." The old monk nodded proudly. Several weeks later, peace returned to the kingdom. The rebellion ended. The Order of the Black Raven was dissolved forever. Ravenstone Castle was rebuilt in honor of those who had fallen. A great memorial was raised for Sir Richard Ashcroft, the knight who had sacrificed everything to protect the true heir. Another statue stood beside him, honoring Sir William, whose courage had saved England's future.
Exactly
Lady Isabella
100
became
years
Edward's
ago,
closest advisor,
in the year
and the protector of
1926,
Greyhaven Abbey.
in a
As for
small
Edward,
mountainous
he never
village,
forgot the lessons
lived a
his
young
father had taught
orphan
him.
named
Every year,
Anand.
on the
Anand
anniversary
was
of the Battle of
extremely
Ravenstone,
kind,
he returned alone to the
hearted
castle
but
walls.
deeply
There,
impoverished.
he would
One
quietly
day,
whisper,
while
"I
cleaning
kept my
the old
promise,
library
Father."
of the
Above
village
him,
landlord's
the banners of
mansion,
England flew
he
proudly
found
in
a
the
strange
wind. The
silver
kingdom had
pocket
found
watch
not
hidden
only its
inside a
lost crown,
crack in the
but
wall.
also a
It
king
was no
worthy of
ordinary
wearing it.
watch. It didn't tick, but instead emitted a soft melodic tune. The moment Anand touched the watch, the air around him seemed to freeze. He realized this watch was calling him toward an unknown destiny. The hands inside the watch suddenly began to indicate directions like a compass. With only a water flask and a small amount of dry food as his belongings, Anand set out on a long journey. He had to cross dense, dark forests where the roars of wild animals constantly terrified him. Next, he had to traverse a vast, scorching desert. Even when his throat was parched with thirst, he refused to give up. Along the way, he faced many temptations. Many sorcerers offered him immense wealth in exchange for the watch, but Anand held on to his honesty. This long journey, spanning over years, exhausted him mentally and physically, but the good soul inside him never wavered. Finally, after long hardships, Anand arrived at the peak of a massive snow-covered mountain. Hidden there was an abandoned, cursed palace. Upon entering the palace, he saw a stone statue with a hollow space in its chest, exactly the size of the silver watch. As Anand went to place the watch into the hollow, a mystical witch appeared. The witch said, "If you place this watch here, you will turn into stone. But all mankind will be freed from disease and poverty." Anand did not hesitate for a single moment. Disregarding his own life, and thinking only of the welfare of humanity, he placed the watch into the statue's chest. But the very next moment, a miracle happened. A brilliant light illuminated everything. Anand did not turn into stone. Instead, the witch, like mystical entity, transformed into a benevolent angel. The angel smiled and said, "I was only testing your selflessness. Despite countless hardships, you did not lose your honesty and were ready to give your life for others." With the angel's blessing, the old palace transformed into a golden palace. All of Anand's exhaustion vanished, and he was proclaimed the king of a vast kingdom. Not only that, but because of Anand's selfless sacrifice, long-lasting peace and prosperity descended upon the entire world. Anand spent the rest of his life serving the people, and thus, after a long and difficult journey, the story reached a beautiful and happy ending.
Exactly 100 years ago, in the year 1926, in a foggy mountainous village located in a remote region of India, lived a calm and patient young man named Samir. Samir loved spending hours in old libraries. One day, in a dark corner of the library, inside a hidden, dusty drawer, he found an ancient, leather-bound diary. Opening the diary, he was astonished. It described a lost, mystical valley that becomes visible to human eyes for only a brief period every 100 years. Following the map, Samir entered a forest so dense that sunlight had never touched its ground. The forest was utterly silent, except for the occasional soft rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. Samir walked for days and nights continuously. The trees inside this forest were colossal, covered in a strange, glowing blue moss that dispelled the darkness of the night with a soft, soothing light. As he walked, his shoes tore apart, and his physical strength began to deplete rapidly. Yet, he did not stop. When he finally sat down under a massive tree out of exhaustion, a mystical deer appeared before him. The deer's eyes were as bright as stars, seemingly waiting to guide Samir. Samir stood up once more and began to follow the gentle glow. This walk was incredibly long and lonely, testing the absolute limits of his patience. As the forest ended, a vast, endless desert stretched before Samir. But this was no ordinary desert. There was no wind and absolutely no sound. It was known as the Desert of Silence. Walking through here, all of a person's negative thoughts, fears, and past sorrows would manifest in their mind. When Samir reached the middle of the desert, He envisioned all the lost memories and hardships of his life. He felt as though he wouldn't survive, that all this long suffering might be in vain. Right then, he touched the diary in his pocket and calmed his mind. Closing his eyes, he took a deep, steady breath, conquered his fears, and moved forward. At the very edge of the desert, he found a massive stone gate shrouded in thick fog. An old gatekeeper sat before it. The old man said, "To pass through this gate, you must sacrifice the most valuable thing you possess." Samir smiled and handed over his beloved ancient diary, knowing that reaching the destination was more important than holding on to the guide. As the stone gate ground open, Samir's eyes were dazzled. He found himself standing in a heavenly valley. All around, rivers of deep blue water flowed, emitting a supernatural soothing fragrance. Nestled on the mountain slopes was an ancient city, where houses made of gold and crystal glistened in the warm evening light. The people of the city were incredibly kind, with no trace of sorrow on their faces. The moment they saw Samir, they welcomed him with immense warmth. Hearing the story of Samir's honesty, enduring patience, and ultimate sacrifice, the king of the valley embraced him. The king proclaimed that Samir would be the new guardian of this valley. Instantly, all of Samir's exhaustion, the wounds on his feet, and the long-held sorrows of his mind vanished. He spent the rest of his life in absolute happiness within that calm, magical city. Peace reigned over the entire world, and thus, after a tremendously long, difficult, yet beautiful journey, Samir's life reached a deeply peaceful and happy ending.